the discussion which Ukrainian Crisis Media Center called Diagnostics Without Politics. We analyzed the work of the national work of Ukraine in order to understand what's going on and why do we hear the opposite political statements. And I welcome Mr. Ruslan Chornyi, editor-in-chief from the FinCLub, and Yuriy Prozorov, president of the Ukrainian Society of Financial Analysts. We have just two panelists, and the key issue which you suggest you to discuss is the assessment of the national bank's work from the bank sector point of view. What did they do? What have they done? And what is the efficiency of their work? Mr. Ruslan, we will start with you. Can I speak Russian? Of course. Let us start with the issue which we discussed in the course of the previous panel. How much did the business lose from the NBU policy? I think around 400 billion hryvnia. These are lost dollars, $400 billion. I think these are lost jobs, not sold goods. I think this is the main problem which is a major concern for people and why they are so angry with Gontaria. Whether this could be prevented, I'm not sure. Maybe they would be able to protect legal entities or private clients to move to other banks. But one of the reasons is that this was difficult to predict. We do not have experts in this area. Looking at other countries, I should recognize that this process remains equally inefficient in many countries. Those banks which now are under administration or are in the bank fund of guarantees this is a solution to a problem which had been existent for many years. Even in President Yushchenko times, I kept saying to him, why you do not pay sufficient attention to this problem when so many deposits of private people, while so many loans were given to the bad borrowers. And when that bank collapsed, there is a huge blow on the system. But the NBU closed eyes on the shortcomings in the work of that bank. That is, at that time, there was a very strong corruption in the NBU. Each malfunctioning of the bank was resolved or mitigated with the national bank due to huge bribes, and that is what Gontarev's team rejected to do, and I'm very grateful to them for this, that they carried out sanation of the banking system, and I am happy for the actions that were made. I am grateful for the messages that were communicated, because they really had grounds, that messages. So the advantage of the bank, the strength of the bank, of NBU, is that they managed to carry out reforming, they managed to carry out sanation of Ukrainian banks. Now we know the beneficiaries of all the banks. We know that refinancing is transparent. We know the rates. We know the collaterals for that refinancing, and I think all these are very positive features which added transparency, which decreased charges in corruption in the national bank. And I think that now the national bank should expose the real scale of the problems in each bank to the public, and for example, we know that one of the biggest banks in the country had not shown the share of related credits, of internal credits inside the group, because of the interests of some groups. And this suggests that the work of NBU in sanation should be continued. And also we should finalize this exposition of banks which credit the businesses of their owners.
I do not agree in everything with Mr. Chornyi. We need to look wide at the problem. For the last 2 weeks, we're looking only at personalities. The conflict is in the about the personalities between the MPs and the governor of the National Bank. We see that there's the group of supporters on the one side and quite big group of people who are ready to replace the personality of the governor. But this is simplified. We need to look at it differently. The banks are not existing separately. They have always been the blood system of the economy, but now these vessels are plugged. Why? We need to answer that question. Whether the regulator, the national bank, is to be blamed, who the MPs in 2015 gave superpowers. And now
функции, которые депутаты ей передали, дали независимость, национальную.
And now saying that Gontareva is not exercising all the functions. Many heads of the departments of the National Bank receive more money in salary more than MPs. Maybe that is why the population demands from the National Bank. Now, when you're working in new conditions, you are trusted by the IMF, by all our allies, by the business associations which represent foreigners who operate in our market, and they operate in dollars and euros. So the situation is quite normal. The second position, those who are inside Ukraine, we see what are the anti-ratings and what is the trust or mistrust to the governor of the National Bank. I believe that the banking associations, which are independent, will publish their rating, and the figures there will be maybe opposite. Do you remember some previous ratings? These are traditional surveys. The colleagues were saying that there were 70% of trust to the institutions, not the personalities, but we see that the mistrust to the National Bank is 82% and the mistrust to commercial banks is 77%. The money disappeared in commercial banks, but there's more mistrust to the National Bank. And 1% can personally trust money to the governor of the National Bank. That is a serious anti-rating. I disagree with Ruslan. If we have 10 more surveys, the figures will be the same. These are awful figures, they are bad. And that means that, in fact, the cleanup that we are talking about, the cleanup of the banking system, this cleanup is like removing from the system those banks which work badly. After the cleanup, there should be the recovery, but the recovery doesn't happen. Those who are counterpartners of Gontareva, they say that that's not cleanup. It's like when the field is cleaned and the rest of the bank should start functioning in this field. Whether they will function, is there a trust to deposits if we divide it by 26 exchange rate or 28 exchange rate? This will be wrong. We see that there's money in the country, both in hryvnia and in currency, but they're not transformed via banking system. And this cleanup did not produce the result. So that all those who survived, so that they start operating like they operated before the beginning of cleanup. I believe it's not the cleanup, it's the process of cleaning out. And that is done so that on the field which will be cleaned out, new players come. They're not in the banking system of Ukraine. After that devaluation and inflation spiral that merged many banks, that acquired many banks. I believe that most banks did not work as crediting and depositing institutions. I was arguing with Mr. Suginyak in 2014 and 2015. I published an article that concentration of banking system is irreversible in the next 10-15 years, but in 5 years the situation was so that first 5 banks took 80-90% of the bank of crediting.
Банков с украинским капиталом, которые есть на рынке. Понятно, хвосту боль.
The main question is, in the body of our banking system, we have the banks with foreign capital, 2 state-owned banks, which will be privatized, according to preliminary agreements which have been achieved. And in the body there are no big and middle-sized Ukrainian banks. We have the head, which for the last 2 weeks has many problems. Because now there's this fighting between the National Bank and MPs. Because everything was in English, in memorandum, and everyone knew it back in September. But now when it was translated into Ukrainian, the politicians and the journalists read what would be happening. Now there's no competition between the surnames. If this cleaning out is completed and if new players come, they will either, we will lose.
Юрий, что же вы натворили? Нет, последняя фраза была про российские банки. У нас же антикризовий центр. Може
В будь-якому випадку можна звинувачувати Путіна. Але ми власне, через 1,5 року, мабуть, після початку агресії, ми почали думати над тим, щоб змінити назву з антикризового центру. Почали розуміти, що відбувається з реформами, що відбувається з ринковими перетворами, і зрозуміли, що ще є потреба в українському кризовому медіа-центрі.
Логично було все-таки називати антикризисом. Ні, є таке питання, як кризова кімната, кризовий штаб, він не називається антикризовим. Кризовий, якщо є там банки чи там
Саме засідають в адміністрації, що це немає. А що кажуть у нас перші? Скажете, коли
Раз, два, три. Є?
Раз.
Окей. Можемо продовжувати, колеги? Дякую. Можу продовжувати, перепрошую, у нас була технічна перерва. Я тоді відштовхнусь від того, що ви казали. Ви з одного боку кажете, що дискусія ведеться.
On the one hand, you say that there's discussion between politicians and that's political thing. On the other hand, you say that new players may come. We remember how in the middle of 2000, new banks came and they had many problems because there was no financial awareness. People didn't know what to do. My question is, how should people get ready to all these discussions? We see political discussions, but no financial discussions around what is to be done. What to do, how to avoid, how to clean up the system? This is the key question. That I would like to hear the answer to.
Well, I will finish what I started to say before we had that technical interruption. I think that there are three possible scenarios. One manifestation of what's going on. This is the brochure of Taruta. The issue about the first bank raised when the IMF memorandum was translated into Ukrainian. The issue about Taruta's bank appeared after meeting in MPs in Verkhovna Rada. But not all the experts support the positive assessment of the NBU activities. For example, the banking committee in Verkhovna, which drafted 50 to 57, frightened the NBU about limiting the independence of the national bank. I would ask my colleagues who signed the letter signed by 13 bankers whether they have read that draft law. The NBU is made more responsible to the NBU board. The NBU board and its the NBU CO and its and her deputy CO is made responsible to the board. This draft law also increases transparency of the NBU as a whole against society in general, and the obligation is introduced about those banks, bad banks, which are now in the guarantee fund, and the obligation to disclose information about these banks before bringing them into the guarantee fund. I understand what the National Bank dislikes, the registration of the necessity to register decisions in the Ministry of Justice. Also, the board has to establish KPI if the NBU leadership does not stick with that KPI. The board may apply to the president and raise the issue about the head of the National Bank. The NBU even is not brought back to the civil service. They would continue to get their high salaries. So maybe the leaders of the big banks have not read this draft law. they do not wish to have this accountable NBU, but I think that is what we need in our country. What can you offer to read except Taruta's brochure? First of all, I would like to refer to the statements made by Yuriy. I would like to disagree with some statements. We now we should not make speculations that the system is cleaned up to allow big Western players to come. I do not like suggestions that some big bank will now enter and like big British bank, it will buy somebody and will occupy the entire market. But in 1 year, the amendments in the banking sector will come to force, and the foreign banks will simply come to this market not via buying Ukrainian banks, but via renting them. And by that moment, it's good to have in place strong players able to work in the market. But I agree with Yuriy that now we have small and big and bigger and medium-sized banks which look for the niches in the business. Some owners now think about becoming a payment center, mortgage loans, or only retailer banks, or only corporate banks, and that's normal. But when we look at the practice of foreign, the practice of national banking sector for 12 years, I should say that only universal banks survive. Only those banks which are able to adapt to changing conditions, they are able to survive. Nevertheless, the banking environment will definitely change. What I could advise to the clients: look carefully with what bank do you cooperate, who are shareholders of this bank, whether they are available on the NBU website. The clients should pay attention with what bank do they cooperate. Today, many foreign banks keep trying to quit from Ukrainian market. Very soon, Russian banks will try to escape from Ukrainian market. Some big European banks would like to leave Ukraine, but in this case, they would experience huge losses. An example was with Commerzbank, which invested 4 billion euros into Ukraine and lost them. Bank and Ukrexim Bank invested big amounts of money here, and EBRD money are there. So these investors will maintain the presence of those banks in Ukrainian market. I agree with Ruslan that the niche model, which was positioned as high-tech banks, fintech banks, did not work in Ukraine. In order to keep trust of the client, the bank just have to pay and not try to be a niche bank. I disagree that we may have 2-3 shareholders in the banks. All the banks should be joint stock companies. We should not have 1, 2, 3, 10 shareholders. I think that the National Bank will later come back to this approach when our banks will be shareholder companies. Because the set of problems that we experienced this year with Mikhailovsky and Krещатик Bank, but nevertheless, we may draw positive opinion from that examples. The draft law about split regulators, which is in memorandum of the IMF, the supervision over consumer service, over financial service consumer would be more careful. The next year, we will experience insurance market cleaning, and we may only make assumptions how many insurance companies will survive that supervision. I would like to remind about the next step, which should follow unification of all the functions. The National Bank should be split in two parts: supervision over all financial institutions and monetary function, emission center, which should be separate, well separated part of the National Bank. Why it is needed? I would like to comment. This was the draft law when I used to be a deputy head of the State Commission on Financial Services. This would allow us to split supervision. Mega regulator, the central bank, which is unified. This is one approach. It is made responsible for market supervision. That is what was done in Russian Federation. But they found out that the system proved to be inefficient. That's why I agree with Ruslan that the next step should be reforming of supervision. We should have not big but efficient central bank and very efficient supervisory body. And finally, if the personal changes would not happen, there might be changes to Constitution 5303 to change the mandate of the National Bank. What Mr. Mikolajchuk mentioned. Now MPs wish NBU to support jobs creation among population, economic growth support, and the third function, currency stability. And would you please say a couple of words about key obstacles to revival of trust? We have huge amounts of currency kept by people in cash. The biggest problem with cash with people is the following aspect. The banks collapse very quickly. Foreign bank fall down within one night. During a day, Kubev promised Novinsky that the bank would survive, but at 8 p.m. it was closed. So many people suffered because of this. They got money from the guarantee fund on banks, and now they are scared and keep this cash at home. Also, the NBU tries to find shareholders of many banks to question whether they are financially capable, whether they have sufficient 500,000 million of hryvnia, which they need to have in line with legislation, and that they are not able to withdraw money from the country. They won't withdraw the money of the country in case of failure, of bank failure. Also, by the moment when National Bank states clearly that the bank system cleaning is over, people could not trust to the banking system in general. They are not sure whether they can take their cash to the bank and put it on deposit.
My point of view is such. Back last year, I said when there's no institutional, when we don't do it like that, all the leaders of the country should say, from tomorrow, not a single bank will be made bankrupt. You can trust all banks that are left. And that day they have to remove all the restrictions and limitations. And even the clients who will start withdrawing money that they could not withdraw in 4-5 days when they see that there's money, and they will see that they can exchange currency without any limitation, then in a very short period of time the money will go back to the banking system, like it was in the first during the first Maidan, when there were statements that the banking system will fall in 4 days, but the National Bank was supporting commercial banks so much that there was no crisis. There should be very high level of trust to the authorities, but not to the National Bank, so that we understand. And also, I believe that there should be the signals given to population that you need to say that You need to show that we have more reserves now. Limitation in cash, if it's 50,000 hryvnias, then not more than 50,000 hryvnias.
Проконтролювати. І тоді населення почне.
And then the population will start trusting not just the national bank, but the authorities. And the money will return.
Інструменти, крім банків, на жаль, немає такої альтернативи.
Я можу зробити дещо прогноз.
May I make a forecast? If now there are no new shocks, no crisis like attacks at the national bank, irrespective of who's the governor of the national bank. But now small banks are passing stress tests. They will defend their business plans. So practically, the defense of business plans will finish in the first quarter of next year. After that, it will be clear that the national bank, what does the national bank do with the different banks, and what is what will happen to them. By summer, we will understand that what to do with the clients of the banks which were made bankrupt, how to transfer them to other healthy banks, and the trust to the system should be there.
Ну, скажімо так, населення звикло до того, що
The population had to get used to the stability, and then by September next year, the trust will be restored. Any questions? We had wonderful answers. Thank you for your time. Thank you for explanation. Thank you to all who were watching us. Thank you, and we continue our work in 15 minutes. Thank you.